Racial hierarchy and its impact on social mobility and access to institutions is an important issue that is often ignored. Since the topic is very broad and affects the entire world, I will narrow it down and focus on an archipelago off the coast of Panama. Here, there are three main racial groups: expats, Afro-Antilleans, and indigenous people called Nagobi. I lived on an island in this archipelago called Bocas del Toro and was provided with many instances to observe the diverse ethnic makeup of the area, as well as a wide range of socioeconomic backgrounds. Variations in race and class can be seen across the archipelago, from the indigenous communities to the expats that reside in Panama. These differences have serious implications for the people living in the area. Unfortunately, social mobility is greatly impacted by these socio-ethno and economic structures. Many institutions set up in Panama are designed to limit the degree of social mobility that people can achieve. Ultimately, the primary structure impacting social mobility is racial hierarchy, which leads to varying degrees of access to institutions. This, in turn, is devastating to those who are constantly being oppressed. Racial hierarchy can be seen in Panama, and in particular, Bocas del Toro archipelago. There is a class system between the Nagobi, Afro-Antilleans, and expats, who are typically from the United States, which favors expats as well as Afro-Antilleans over the indigenous communities. This structure has many negative impacts, however, through the privileging of certain races, while the Nagobi continue to exist as marginalized members of Bocas society. According to the World Directory of Minorities and Indigenous People, English speakers are often privileged in this society, which allows the English-speaking Afro-Antilleans to obtain higher-paying jobs. This is seen as part of the result of the racial hierarchy, since Afro-Antilleans were taught English due to the slave trade, which resulted in a large proportion of this ethnic group living in Bocas and speaking English today. Due to this English preference, Afro-Antilleans are considered higher in the racial class system than the indigenous Nagobi. This inability to get jobs based on language barriers created by a racial hierarchy has caused the social immobility of the indigenous people. Racial hierarchy ultimately determines people's access to institutions, including education, which in turn impacts the social mobility of certain races. There is a cycle many people are trapped in that leads to constant social immobility, which is specifically seen and highlighted in indigenous communities. According to the World Bank, racial preferencing of Afro-Antilleans over the Nagobi in the job market, according to them, indigenous people have very low levels of human capital and skills, and are significantly less likely to move out of poverty. This lack of wealth inhibits many indigenous people from accessing education if a school is not close to their community. Being able to access school or some form of education is an opportunity that not everyone appreciates. There are so many people out there who are trying so hard to receive an education yet are unable to. This barrier to education is particularly seen on Isla Popa, where the school system only teaches through the 9th grade. And for further education, the students have to travel to other islands. If parents cannot afford to pay for this additional expense, their children are unable to continue their education. This limited access to education determines which jobs their children will be able to obtain in the future. It has been shown in Bocas that non-indigenous poor were more likely to obtain jobs in the fast-growing service and the construction sectors because they had more education, according to the 2011 World Bank release. In Bocas and Panama as a whole, many jobs now require English, which makes it difficult to find a safe and well-paying job if you do not speak English. The cycle repeats once the children who have gone through this system raise children of their own and are unable to pay for their children's education. This cycle does not occur as frequently, however, among children of other ethnicities. For instance, expats are able to provide their children with an education that is farther away from their home, as well as bring in tutors to supplement where the school system lacks. These families have greater access to education based on their wealth, which stems from being white and having the ability to speak English. Overall, it seems in Panama that the institution of education promotes social immobility to certain classes based on race. Another institution that promotes social immobility is healthcare. Once again, Indigenous and rural communities are impacted the most. The ability to reach a hospital or doctors is extremely difficult for people living in isolated areas, and many of the communities cannot afford to travel or pay for the care that they need. In fact, according to the World Bank, in these areas, 62% of children under 5 have been affected by stunting due to malnutrition. While the malnutrition partially stems from low income, which ultimately stems from the lack of education and an oppressive racial hierarchy, it is also due to the lack of affordable and reachable health care. This only adds to the recurring cycle of poverty. If people are unable to afford or reach the proper health care that they need, they will not be physically or mentally able to work or be prepared to receive an education. This in turn prevents them from escaping poverty and providing for their children's futures. In Bocas, marginalization of Indigenous people is evident in various aspects of everyday life. For instance, the majority of restaurants are directed at wealthier people who speak English. Many restaurants in town are even unaffordable for Indigenous people. According to the World Bank, this is evident due to the fact that 83% of Indigenous people live below the poverty line, and 70% do not even meet the minimum caloric requirements. Along with not being able to afford to eat at these places, the Indigenous Nagobi's limited access for education prevents them from obtaining jobs at these places. Instead, the restaurants are aimed for tourists or wealthier Panamanians, and even the staff is composed of expats and English speakers. In particular, there's one hostel called Selena Hostels, and they do not give back to the community in any economic or social means, and that's just one example of the many places around the world that do this. The tourism institution that is established in Bocas pushes the Indigenous people out of the community and the town. Although many people argue that hard work and perseverance is the only thing necessary to be successful in life, this is a false claim. It has been shown time and time again that race plays a major role in people's ability to get education, get certain jobs, and receive equal access to institutions when compared to Caucasian people. According to a social research interview written by Spalding, social mobility is impacted and prevented by certain conditions such as institutionalized racism, discrimination, economic disadvantage, and political economic factors. These conditions all play a role in the racial hierarchy that is established in Bocas del Toro, as well as in Panama. This racial hierarchy is implemented in everyday institutions, such as education and healthcare, and prevents minorities from accessing what they need in order to become socially mobile. Constant marginalization, particularly towards the Indigenous communities, continues to suppress specific races and keep them in poverty. These issues are not only happening in poverty in Panama, but all across the world. One major issue is how race plays a role in housing and evictions. It can be devastating to lose your home and not know where you will sleep. This in turn impacts every other area of someone's life. We need to begin to recognize and implement changes in order to help break through these cycles.